In the first Trump term, it was James Comey and Robert Mueller and anonymous leaks and lawfare and Russian collusion. Seems like the second Trump term is all about federal judges. They're the resistance. And what's that all about? Well, how about we talk to an expert on that and a whole lot of other things plaguing our culture? He's Josh Hammer, and he's our special guest today. My name's Larry O'Connor. You can call me Larry. Not only is Josh Hammer the host of the Josh Hammer Show, which I don't know how they found Josh Hammer to host that show, but well done, whoever's producing that. He's also a syndicated columnist. He's the senior editor at large at Newsweek, and he's also senior counsel at the Article 3 Project. So there's a lot to cover with Josh Hammer. He's also a great conversation. Josh, good to talk to you, my friend. Thanks for being here.
Larry, it's been too long. Great to see you.
Let's put that Article 3 hat on, shall we? First of all, for those who went to public school, sadly, and didn't watch Schoolhouse Rock, explain what Article 3 is and why we even need a project to look after it.
Well, Larry, I'm actually a product of public school myself. So, whether a public or a private school grads here, our Article 3 is just the third branch of government. Article 3 is the federal judiciary. Article 1 is the Congress. Article 2 is the executive branch. Article 3 is the judiciary. Now, once upon a time, we had this guy named Alexander Hamilton who famously wrote in the Federalist number 78 that Article 3, the federal judiciary, is the least dangerous branch of the three branches because it has neither force nor will, but merely judgment, and depends upon the efficacy of the executive branch even for the enforcement of its own judgments. Unfortunately, Larry, at some point, especially post-World War II, post-1950s, 1960s, we've had the rise of this notion of judicial supremacy, where Article 3, the federal judiciary, has assumed the mantle. They basically self-assumed it. They've arrogated to themselves powers that they never had. And today, in many ways, they think and act as if they are not co-equal to the other branches, which they're actually not. They're literally inferior, I would argue. But they act in a way that they're not even just equal, as they act in a way that they are actually superior. So that is the need for this whole project, the Article 3 project, is basically to try to have some voices on the right to try to tell judges, you know what, settle down a little bit. You guys basically should know your place. It's kind of the old analogy, Larry, that Laura Ingraham said so many years ago, shut up and dribble. I guess I would kind of summarize the Article 3 project approach as basically being shut up and judge.
By the way, I think it was Shut Up and Sing when she first came up with it with the Dixie Chicks, but it turned into LeBron and Shut Up and Dribble. It's incredible to me that the left really loves the Puerto Rican hip hop singing Alexander Hamilton, but the actual Alexander Hamilton, they've got major issues with. So you just delved into something that I think we can explore a little bit. Because it's sort of resonating in the headlines today. And that this whole idea of either judicial supremacy, where they get a veto on legislation or executive actions, or this notion of co-equal branches of government, where if all three are co-equal and nobody can cancel each other out, how do you get anything done? And then your premise here, which is actually the judiciary is sort of inferior to the legislature, which I like the best because they're the one branch that doesn't directly answer to the people. So they should have some subservience.
Yeah, Larry, I clerked on the Fifth Circuit 7 years ago. My former boss, Judge James C. Ho, Trump nominee in the first term, my personal pick for next SCOTUS justice. He would be truly phenomenal. So Judge Ho actually had a concurrence literally just last week, actually, in the Fifth Circuit, touching on this exact topic. And he actually says pretty much verbatim what I just said, which is that this common refrain that the judiciary is a co-equal branch, it's literally just not true. I mean, to once again kind of pull out this Hamilton notion, which is literally true today, the judges cannot even enforce their own orders. All they have is the persuasive power of their own pens. If we want to get to the nuts and bolts of this, the way that a federal judicial decision is actually enforced comes from the U.S. Marshals. But think about it, Larry. Where do the U.S. Marshals get their paycheck? Does John Roberts sign off their paycheck? No, the paycheck comes from DOJ, in this case from Pam Bondi. The U.S. Marshals sit in Article 2 there. So they quite literally are the least dangerous branch there. And it's just totally nonsensical, this notion that when a 5-4 majority of the Supreme Court issues a ruling as it pertains to the litigants before it, that this becomes the binding law of the land affecting all people. Larry, the number one people in American history who best understood this notion and objected to it, and this notion being what I call judicial supremacy, the number one opponent of this in American history was a guy by the name of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, after the Dred Scott case of 1857, the single worst case case in SCOTUS history. They said that black people could never be citizens there. In his debates the following year with Stephen Douglas, he famously said that if I get to the U.S. Senate and if I, let's see what happens from there, I am not going to enforce this judgment as pertains to anyone other than Mr. Scott himself. And sure enough, Lincoln doubles down in his March 1861 first inaugural address, and he willfully defies that order as president when he issues passports to blacks in the Western Territories, does things like that in direct defiance of Dred Scott. So this notion that judges don't just issue a judgment as pertains to the people literally sitting there in the courtroom, but they kind of just, this random judge in Hawaii can set the national law of the land. It's a fundamental distortion of our separation of powers at the most basic, fundamental 35,000-foot altitude level view level.
When Abe did that, did the Jake Tapper of the era furrow his brow and warn everyone that we have a constitutional crisis?
I mean, Lincoln had his detractors. I think that would be an understatement. In many respects, Lincoln still has his detractors today.
Yeah.
I mean, some people call him a tyrant. I mean, you have all the usual suspects there. But the test of time clearly showed that Abraham Lincoln was correct, and he had, I think, a very sound conception of judicial power. I would argue.
He used his executive powers for eventual good ends, so that everything you just laid out there, how does it square with Marbury versus Madison? And again, I've got a public education too. So maybe I'm not completely confident on what that was supposed to do, but I thought that did set, it's not in the founding documents, but Marbury-Madison sort of set the precedent and jurisprudence there for the Supreme Court, at the very least, to have some level of final say.
So, Larry, fortunately for you, you brought on the right guy to nerd out about legal topics when it comes to things like
Marbury
versus Madison. So I've written on this extensively. So Marbury versus Madison comes out in 1803. This is the great opinion from Chief Justice John Marshall. And there's this very famous line. It's probably the most quoted line from Marbury versus Madison, where Chief Justice Marshall famously says that it is emphatically the province of the judiciary to declare what the law is. But most people, Larry, forget the sentence that comes just after. It's actually a second sentence. I don't have it memorized verbatim, but paraphrasing very closely, it basically says, and they shall apply the law in the case before it. And that's the important point there, is that, yes, they declare what the law is, but as it applies to the actual case or controversy, to use the language of Article 3 of the Constitution, meaning the actual parties, the litigants, the actual law, the fact pattern there. You hear the facts, and then you apply the law as it pertains to a case or controversy there. That is a very long stretch from modern judicial supremacy, which comes from a 1958 case, a kind of pretty obscure case called Cooper versus Aaron, where the court, for the very first time in American history in 1958, said that we are the final arbiter of what the law is in this country there. Now, the context of Cooper versus Aaron is interesting because it comes 4 years after Brown versus Board of Education. It's in the context of what the lawyers call Brown 2, the follow-up case, and the broader desegregation fights. That was the context that Cooper versus Aaron made this claim there. So for that reason, because of the very, very sensitive political valence surrounding it there, a lot of people are afraid to criticize it, but I'm not afraid to criticize it because it's wrong. It is just wrong that the Supreme Court is the sole final arbiter of law throughout this country. That was not the way it worked until 1958, and God willing, at some point we'll have a civil awakening in this country, and we will realize that is not the government that our founders bequeathed us, and it is frankly incumbent upon us to take it back there. But Marbury versus Madison stands for judicial review. It stands for the proposition that judges can apply the law to a case, but it does not stand for the proposition that judges can bind everyone outside of the actual walls of their courtroom across the country.
Well, and of course, that was a Supreme Court decision. Now you've got these circuit court judges thinking that they can bind the entire nation and handcuff the presidency, which brings this sort of hypothetical academic conversation to today's headlines. We have this small handful of federal judges who are just basically standing in the way of the progress that the executive actions that President Trump is trying to take. And this goes to fundamental executive powers like deporting illegal aliens, criminals, people who are determined to be enemies of the country under the Alien Enemies Act. But even so far as to whether the executive branch can write checks and fund USAID or some other executive branch administrative duty. Where does this lead us? Where does it end?
Well, it hopefully ends with the political branches, Article 1, Article 2, the Congress and the executive branch pushing back against this, because that's the way it's actually supposed to work.
How do they do that exactly? Does it require more legislation, Josh? I'm sorry for jumping in, or is it just, the Congress stepping in and enforcing whatever kind of control they have over these courts. Because people think that all these courts fall under John Roberts and the Supreme Court. They don't, do they?
No. Look, Article 3 of the Constitution, again, says that, that there shall be one Supreme Court and however many inferior courts as shall Congress from time to time establish, which is
Congress establishes.
Correct.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's some legalese there. What it means is that literally every federal court, every federal judgeship outside of the Marble Palace where the nine-robed oracles sit is essentially a creature of Congress's creation. And it logically follows that which has been created by Congress can be destroyed by Congress. But there's all sorts of remedies that Congress can do if they want to get creative here, short of actually abolishing judgeships and abolishing courts, which, again, they absolutely can do that if they want to there. Congress, just to take one example that I'm particularly keen on, Congress has full ability to actually legislate what remedies a federal court can give in a case or not. If Congress wanted to legislatively abolish this notion of so-called nationwide injunctions tomorrow, if they want to tell federal courts tomorrow that you are not allowed to bind anyone outside of your courtroom, outside the named parties to a case, they can totally do that. And Congress, throughout our history, has at times done that when they've actually had their act together there. Short of defining remedies there, you can engage in jurisdiction stripping legislation. Congress has the ability to basically strip federal judges of the ability to preside over certain cases, which would have the effect of then kicking those cases from federal court to state courts, where we likely have a little more direct, lowercase r Republican oversight over the judges in the various states, especially those that have judicial elections and things like that there. So Congress can do that. There's also judicial impeachment, which is probably not going to happen if I'm just being sober here. As a basic matter of arithmetic, you would need a 2/3 majority to convict such an impeached judge in the Senate there, where that's probably not going to happen given realities. But it nonetheless would send a very important message, I think, for Mike Johnson, for Jim Jordan, the House Judiciary Committee, to get those articles of impeachment solidified there. There have been a couple of moves in that direction. Congressman Brandon Gill, the freshman of Texas, has suggested that for certain judges there. I believe for Judge Boasberg in D.C., if memory serves there. I would like to see that happen, Larry, if nothing else, as a civic exercise. But the proper remedy in general, to kind of get back to this James Madison, Federalist 51 notion, ambition shall be made to counteract ambition, that's kind of checks and balances 101. It really ought to come from the Congress, with the executive branch then playing a supporting role.
Does Roberts have any role here, though? Can Roberts sort of
Yes.
speak out or issue? What can he do?
John Roberts 1,000% has a role here. So SCOTUS, there's multiple dockets at the United States Supreme Court. There was the docket that most people are familiar with, which is called the merits docket. That's the whole process where you actually file a petition for a writ of certiorari to have your case heard, and then the judges deliberate. They grant the petition there, if you're so lucky, and then you have oral argument, and people talk about the oral argument, and then a few months later you have a written opinion. That's called the merits docket. But there's also something called the emergency docket. Some legal nerds call it the rocket docket or the shadow docket. All these things essentially refer to the same thing there, which are not necessarily kind of the formal process of a cert petition and so forth there. That is often these emergency appeals where you have a ruling against a government, and then the DOJ is going to emergency appeal to kind of stay the lower court's injunction, things like that there. The Supreme Court has a ton of discretion to wade in here and to essentially swat down these lower court injunctions that are out of line there. They have done a very, very, very poor job of doing that thus far, which I think says more about John Roberts than anything else. Larry, I actually wrote a column maybe about a month ago or so, month and a half ago. Townhall actually runs my syndicated column, so you can read it actually right there at Townhall. And in the column, I argued that John Roberts has done more than any person in the entire country, actually, to undermine the legitimacy of the United States Supreme Court. Ironically, that's what he claims to care the most about, is the legitimacy there. But he could solidify that legitimacy tomorrow if he wanted to, by getting more involved, he and his fellow justices, in swatting down these lawless orders and taking on a more humble approach towards the other two branches of government.
Yeah, I did see that column, and it was brought to my attention through a retweet, if we're still using that phrase, by none other than Mark Levin. He was impressed with that as well, and it is true. It's amazing how people get into office like this, even Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and they think that their job is to protect the institution, not the Constitution. But that's where we are. The media plays a big role in this. We were just talking about these federal judges with Josh Hammer and how federal judges are overstepping their bounds and obstructing the executive branch. And then in the shadow of that storyline in the mainstream media, look at this headline from Axios. on Friday. Breaking FBI arrests judge in Wisconsin, with a picture of FBI Director Kash Patel. Josh, obviously this is meant to say, oh my gosh, they're out arresting judges for disagreeing with Trump. But this isn't even a federal judge. It has nothing to do with any executive action or anything that's been in the headlines. Axios knows that. They made it look like there's some sort of, fascist act going on here. But we know now what that Wisconsin judge did to earn her arrest.
Yeah, Judge Dugan here in Milwaukee County, Wisconsin, if memory serves, was actively trying to hide an illegal alien from facing potential deportation, likely deportation, actually, from ICE and the federal government there. And the left is now crying foul, Larry. You know how this goes. They're saying, "Oh, they're arresting a judge. It's tyranny. It's a law enforcement officer. It's an officer of the peace there." But, once upon a time, Larry, and by once upon a time, I mean basically yesterday, the left liked to howl and shriek how no one is above the law. How many times, literally how many times since Alvin Bragg trot out there at that press conference to announce this absurd 34-count indictment with Stormy Daniels against Donald Trump, how many times have we heard this notion that no one is above the law over the past few years? Well, apparently no one is above the law until you have a deeply subversive state court judge that is brazenly flouting federal immigration law in front of immigration officials. The best way to show how utterly asinine this talking point is, as pertains to this particular judge, Judge Dugan, is to illustrate with a hypothetical. Let's say hypothetically that this judge or a different judge walked into the local tavern down in your street and shot someone point blank dead because that person was sleeping with your wife. Okay? I mean, would we really say that judge in that case cannot be prosecuted for homicide because, is the judge above the law or not? The question answers itself there. The relevant question is, have you violated the law and what the law is? In this case, it is federal law. And last I checked, Larry, I mentioned Lincoln earlier in our conversation. This country fought a very bloody civil war to establish the basic principle that federal law is supreme to state law. And in this case, federal law says that if you're an illegal alien, you gotta go. So, this judge is blatantly flouting federal law. And in this case, she had to go be arrested.
Well, and she found out that the federal agents were outside her courtroom. She went and talked to them, sent them down to talk to another judge, and then literally ushered this guy out a back door specifically to evade arrest. By the way, he was in her courtroom because he was accused of some horrific domestic violence, while the victims who were testifying against him were in the courtroom, and they're seeing a judge aid and abet this guy and give him protection. It's like, you're right. She's an officer of the court. This is exactly the behavior that should earn her handcuffs.
It's nuts. It's the kind of stuff that you kind of just, you don't know whether to laugh or cry, right? Yeah. Looking at a situation like this there. This is a state court in Wisconsin. This is not a sub-Saharan African tin pot dictatorship, and literally just trying to clandestinely hide an illegal alien from facing justice. It's just insane stuff there. But it goes to show you the extent of the anti-Trump resistance. You opened the show by talking about Bob Mueller and Russiagate from the first term there.
Right.
Look, this anti-Trump resistance is multifaceted. The judicial component is part of it there, the media component there, the academia. There's so many moving parts here there. But in this particular case, it was a state judge. And, at this point, the state judge is facing justice. And I say thank God for that.
Well, and I opened this segment of our conversation, Josh Hammer, showing what the media is doing here and how the media, either through their sheer ignorance or their blatant lying, probably both, they're actually making this, they're stoking these fires into an inferno, making people who are maybe just casually watching the news as they go by because they're actually, living a normal life, say, oh my gosh, why would Trump be arresting a judge for no reason? Here's another example. Here's ABC News. This is the case of Mahmoud Khalil. Take a look at this one. ICE did not have a warrant when agents detained Mahmoud Khalil, court filings show. Well, if he was deemed an illegal immigrant who had overstayed his visa and a deportation order was put out for him, you don't need a criminal warrant. There are no criminal warrants in that case, are there, Josh?
No, this headline is literally, factually, and legally incorrect. There is no there is no such thing as an arrest warrant to effectuate a removal proceeding for immigration. This is a blatant conflation from some bozo idiot who doesn't know Mary from Maggie or John from Joe. I mean just doesn't know basic differences here.
Right.
I mean, if you want to arrest someone for homicide or rape or a white collar financial crime, yeah, you go to a judge, you get a warrant there. Immigration is a fundamentally different act here. And immigration has actually always been conceived as different from a constitutional legal perspective as well, because for a very long time in this country, there's been something called the plenary power doctrine. That's the legal doctrine. What it essentially says is that the two political branches, again, the Congress and the executive branch, have plenary power. That is absolute power to enforce this nation's immigration laws. Put another way, the judiciary does not dirty its fingers. They don't stick their thumbs in the middle of the political branch's very important duties when it comes to enforcing this nation's immigration laws. I'll take it even further, actually. It was actually in 2018, really not long ago at all, only 7 years ago. That was the very first time that the United States Supreme Court ever declared unconstitutional a federal immigration enforcement statute, because they simply didn't get involved. They basically said, we don't have jurisdiction. There's no judicial review here. If they want to enforce immigration law, they go right ahead there. And then with this, with a particular case of Khalil, I mean, the arrest warrant thing is just pure unmitigated ignorance. But yeah. Larry, they also say, due process, and I guess due process, they think in their stupid heads, they think it relates to the arrest warrant. It doesn't. But due process. So this guy was a legal alien. He was a legal permanent resident because of who he decided to get betrothed to and so forth there. It doesn't matter whether you are an illegal alien or a legal alien. The Constitution does not give you 5th, 14th Amendment due process rights. There's actually a directly on point case here from 1953, a case called Shaughnessy, where a wonderful Supreme Court justice, a man by the name of Justice Robert Jackson, who 9 years prior to this, in the Korematsu case, that was a Japanese internment case, big deal, considered to be one of the worst cases in the court's history there. Justice Jackson dissented in that case because he took a strong due process view. So he was thought of as this great champion of due process because of his dissent in Korematsu. He would later go prosecute Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg. But along the way, he had a very interesting writing in this case in Shaughnessy in 1953, where he famously said that due process does not entail the ability of anyone outside of our borders to come here. You have no due process right to come here from Somalia, for instance. And then once you're here as an alien, legal or illegal, you have no due process right to stay here against the will of the people. Because again, we the people, through our representatives, this is the plenary power doctrine, through our political representatives there, we have the ability to pull the plug on you if we cease to continue thinking that your presence here ultimately redounds to the common good. When we want to pull the plug on you, we can pull the plug, period, full stop, end of story. No stupid arrest warrant or whatnot is required.
When I do a deep dive, long form interview like this, I want to be smarter at the end of it. I want our viewers, our listeners to be smarter. And Josh, you were delivering here. So I appreciate that, because you're giving us so much information to sort of blow through all of the ignorance and the lies that we're seeing right now from the left and from the media. We're speaking with Josh Hammer. He is a senior editor at large at Newsweek. He's the host of the Josh Hammer Show. And we're going to talk about your book, Israel and Civilization, coming up in a moment. But one other legal battle that's transpiring right now in the news I'd love for you to comment on. And this has to do with Harvard. The Trump administration said that for Harvard or Columbia or any private institution or public institution to receive the kind of federal funding that they get for research or what have you, they need to adhere to some certain basic human rights and civil rights criteria, like stamping down on anti-Semitism on your campus and not allowing pro-terrorist protesters to shut you down. Harvard says, hell no. We demand you give us money. And in fact, we have a constitutional right to the money. In fact, it's illegal for you not to give us this money. Who's right here, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my smile probably gives it away, right? But I mean, it's just so farcical, isn't it? I mean, Harvard University, arguably the world's most prestigious, renowned university, there's this bastion of iniquity and Marxist claptrap there on the Charles River in Boston with this 50+ billion dollar endowment, refusing to abide by this nation's civil rights law while simultaneously demanding that they have a constitutional right to your hard-earned taxpayer dollars. I mean, it's just so utterly disgusting. I mean, like, the law is one thing, but the politics of this, the optics of this, how Harvard thinks that this is good for their image, for their branding worldwide. I know that universities like Harvard care a lot about their branding there. When people like Barack Obama, a Harvard law alum, these very high-ranking Democrats come out and defend Harvard's entitlement. I mean, how do you think that plays in proverbial flyover country? Does the plumber in Missouri or the electrician in Oklahoma want his hard-earned taxpayer dollars to go to these entitled, pompous, pieces of what there in Boston, Massachusetts? I mean, it's just utterly insane. The politics of it are suicidal, but frankly, Democrats these days seem like they love taking the wrong side of 80-20 or 90-10, or frankly, in this case, probably 95-5 issues there. But the law is very straightforward, Larry.
I read your op-ed on it. It doesn't sound like there's any legal basis. You would think someone at Harvard would actually, walk across the quad and talk to somebody at Harvard Law. Or does this actually satisfy the jurisprudence of those august lawyers there at Harvard Law these days?
Unfortunately, the vast majority of hot-button political issues like this will have their legal apologists. So, I mean, if I were predicting that this, if God forbid this ends up making it to the U.S. Supreme Court, which I'm not predicting necessarily it will, I don't think it actually will make it that far, to be honest with you. But if it does, I would not be the least bit surprised if someone like a Sonia Sotomayor or Ketanji Brown Jackson were to finagle some sort of legal theory, taking Harvard's side, basically just to kind of try to stick it to the big bad orange man there. But I mean, it's really a ludicrous First Amendment argument. It's totally nuts there. By the way, the best response here is what Hillsdale College very snarkily tweeted at Harvard University. They basically quote tweeted Harvard's very virtue signaling, morally preening statement saying that we're not going to listen to this there. So Hillsdale College basically quote tweeted that and said, well, you guys know you could just not take federal money, right? And that would basically solve your problems there. So
you can do whatever you want, say whatever you want. Absolutely. Although even then, they're still violating people's civil rights, right? Whether they're getting federal funding or not, they're still violating Jewish students' rights.
That's correct. But you would have less of a sort of Damocles, so to speak, over your head there, because there would be less of a threat from the Department of Education, Department of Justice, basically saying, oh, we see what you're doing here. If you want this federal aid there. This kind of way of thinking about the world, how funding can actually disincentivize bad action there, has a lot of ramifications there. So to kind of I don't want to prematurely transition our conversation, Larry, but one way that I think about U.S. foreign aid to Israel is actually the exact same concept actually there. So when it comes to U.S. aid to Israel, actually, one thing that I've long thought is that aid can actually have a perverse mid to long term effect, the exact same way that taxpayer dollars for universities can actually. Because the same way that Harvard probably does not want to be controlled by the dispersers of that aid, so I've actually thought for a long time in this case there, Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu, they probably don't want to be controlled by people like Barack Obama and Joe Biden, do they? I mean, they don't want to be told how to fight their war. They don't want to incentivize people there to kind of, hold this sort of Damocles and say, oh, unless you do X, Y, Z thing there, unless you, in this particular case, send all these supplies into Hamas and Gaza there, we're going to cut off your, we're going to cut off your weapons there. It's the same thing there. So if Harvard is going to learn any lessons, I think Harvard, frankly, should take the Hillsdale College model. And then, frankly, I think Israel would actually be better off, so would the American taxpayer, if we can ultimately kind of extricate ourselves from this bear hug relationship. Not right now, not in the middle of a hot war, but frankly, just in the mid to long term.
Let's spend some time on the book then, as you transitioned us there. The book is Israel and Civilization, the Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. And it sort of draws on the notion that throughout all of human history, or at least civilized history, the enemies of Israel generally end up being the enemies of everything good, frankly. And we are seeing this play out right now, sadly, through obviously the horrific attacks on the people of Israel and Americans and other members of Western civilization who were attending that concert on October 7th. But even more disturbingly, we're seeing it play out in the intelligentsia of the United States higher education campuses, but also in our newsrooms. We're seeing it play out in the streets of London. Josh Hammer. Dwell on this, please, and what it says about where we are right now in the West.
Sure. So the book is called Israel and Civilization. And the key thing to realize about this title is that the word Israel is something of a double entendre, where it does refer to the state of Israel for sure, but it also refers to the children of Israel, the nation of Israel, i.e. the Jewish people. And, the fundamental thing, Larry, that I was doing here with this book, I was not necessarily responding to the horrific October 7th pogrom itself, but I was responding to the world's reaction to the pogrom, where, the world had a moment here where it could have looked at this medieval 7th century Islamist death cult and one of America's most formidable allies, and they could have taken a very clear stance that we're going to side with civilization over barbarism. And the fact that the world was so morally and strategically confused over what to do, that's really why I wrote this book. And fundamentally, Larry, what the book argues is that what we today call Western civilization is in many ways coextensive, coterminous with the Bible, with the world's two great biblical religions, Judaism and Christianity. And I actually argue that the birthplace of Western civilization, based on what I just said there, goes back much further than ancient Greece or ancient Rome. It actually really begins with God's revelation to Moses and the Israelites standing there at Mount Sinai. And I spent a lot of time in this book talking about how the Hebrew Bible in many ways really influences not just our rule of law, our constitution, although it does do that, but also just our day-to-day ethical norms, the way we think about who we are as people, our legal system, and so forth there. So just to give a couple of examples there as to what I mean there. So earlier in the conversation, we kind of had this whole back and forth about how the left has been saying how no one is above the law there. I agree with that there, but does the left actually realize where that principle comes from? It's literally from the book of Deuteronomy. In fact, John Fortescue, a late 14th century, early 15th century conservative English common lawyer, he famously wrote it in his common law treatise that the King of England is not above the law because, and his citation was the book of Deuteronomy there. When it comes to this notion of the separation of powers, the founders were looking extensively to the teachings of the Bible there. Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson actually wanted the national seal of the United States to be Moses parting the Red Sea. I mean, look at the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, this shining beacon, this paean of liberty and human flourishing there. It's not a pagan source that is quoted there on the outside of the bell. It's literally the book of Leviticus. You shall proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. So the book spends a lot of time kind of walking through all this there. And the same way that so go the children of Israel, the Jewish people, so go the West. I argue also so goes the state of Israel, so goes the West. They're basically the same thing, just playing out in slightly different contexts, I argue.
Yeah, I would agree. And as a Christian, I completely adhere to everything that you just laid out. It's obvious, it's historical fact. And as the New Testament shows in our Holy Scriptures, all of these ideas that were developed from the Old Testament and meanings of law and social justice, they continue to develop onto Rome, onto Great Britain, and then onto the Western Hemisphere. It all has its through line back to Moses and to the Abrahamic covenant. And so I guess the question is, what happened? Was it the Enlightenment? Is that what happened, where we were just too smart for our own good and it was intelligentsia that decided to rethink all of these things and put us into this great state that we're in now?
Well, I am sympathetic to some of the critique of the Enlightenment. I mean, I'm a research fellow at the Emmenberg Foundation, which is chaired by my good friend Yoram Hazony, who's been a very outspoken critic of Enlightenment liberalism for a long time there. But I don't spend a lot of time in the book talking about the Enlightenment because I think it's kind of just old hat, frankly, at this point there. Okay. I mean, there's a lot of ways, frankly, in which this country and this civilization more generally really went off the rails there, and Enlightenment liberalism definitely has its share of the blame there. A lot of imports from Europe certainly have their share of the blame there. The rise of the Frankfurt School and the cultural Marxists on canvases in the 1960s. Go on.
But Europe and Germany, they were all influenced by the same laws and the same scriptural understanding from Deuteronomy to Paul and all of the other. So I guess that's where did wokeism, liberalism that sort of tried to I mean, classic liberalism, as we're always told, actually has its roots in biblical truths as well. But what we know as liberalism now, maybe neoliberalism or what have you, is incredibly secular. And in fact, beyond secular, anti-faith, anti-religious, anti-scriptural. And there's a weird harmony there between them and the jihadists. That's why we see, gays for Palestine and that sort of thing without any irony.
Right. So, David Azrad, my good friend, Hillsdale College professor, he wrote a wonderful short essay about this 5 years ago, referring to liberalism's genetic predisposition. It was a wonderful turn of phrase. And what he was getting at was that Enlightenment, quote unquote, classical liberalism, the liberalism of John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, was not necessarily tyrannical in its own right, although I would not identify as such personally. But it was not inherently tyrannical, but it had a predisposition, if not properly safeguarded, to go off in a very terrible, basically mutation and bad direction. And that is basically what he argues is now the rise of modern wokeism. But I do criticize, Larry. I mean, to your point, I do spend a decent amount of time in this book actually criticizing kind of modern Enlightenment liberalism's exaltation of reason qua reason. This notion that if you just close your eyes and kind of tap the old noggin, that we can kind of come up with everything that is good, true, and beautiful there. And to kind of just do one thought exercise here, and my way of attempting to explain why I think that this is ultimately fallacious is, John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, I mentioned them. They have these claims in the 17th and 18th century, respectively, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal there, and so forth there. And the thought exercise is the following. If I were to present to you a Taliban goat herder in the mountains of Afghanistan, would he actually be able to close his eyes, tap the old noggin, and say, oh yeah, wow, it actually is truly self-evident that all men are created equal? And the obvious answer is no, that is not true. This is the ultimate lie at the heart of, for instance, George W. Bush's second inaugural address, the so-called Freedom Agenda, that men all throughout the world universally aspired to the same aims there. And the reason that I argue that men like Locke and Jefferson were able to deduce these conclusions there, because they were thinking, living, and acting within a certain cultural and civilizational milieu. In this particular case there, that is a Judeo-Christian biblical milieu that has as its basis Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, this notion that God created man in his image, male and female, he created them. That right there, Genesis 1:27, that is the antecedent. That is the notion for human equality. That is what ultimately undergirds the Declaration of Independence, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, the Civil Rights Act, all of it, I argue, is ultimately predicated on this biblical worldview. So when you start to separate yourself from lowercase o, Orthodox, Judaism, Christianity, just the great ecumenical biblical inheritance, you will start incrementally moving further and further towards a worldview that does not prioritize genuine moral equality under law. And that, I think, in many ways, is really what is ultimately responsible for the rise of modern wokeism, cultural Marxism, and so forth.
And it is ironic, because then as president, Thomas Jefferson's first major challenge overseas in a military endeavor was against the Barbary pirates, who were basically radical Islamic terrorists. Yeah, right. And I wonder if he would have rethought that notion as well. Given that, I mean, we're both political conservatives in the United States of America. We both align with a political movement that is known as conservatives or Republicans here. How concerned are you about what appears to be a strain within our own ranks, further over to one side, truthfully, but they're there, who were very suspicious, if not downright hostile to the notion of Israel?
Well, I'm very concerned, Larry, and that was definitely one of the reasons that I wrote this book in the first place as well there. I mean, I have a lot of intended audience for this book. Partially it's written for fellow Jews, because my personal story of becoming more observant and traditional kind of weaves its way throughout this book there. So that message is in there. But in many ways, I would say the number one audience for this book are American Christians, and probably above all, younger American Christians, who I think are being tempted and duped and deceived to believe some very bad and incorrect and in many ways deeply unfortunate things. So part of this is coming from kind of what I refer to as a neo-paganism. This is kind of this is kind of where Bronze Age pervert, the online Pseudonymous account, that's where he comes in. People like that, they're basically just trying to kind of throw out the entire biblical inheritance and kind of get us back to a lot of old and neo-pagan claims there. Then you have kind of closely related to that the rise of almost kind of like a pro-philo-Islamic sentiment. That's where the Tate brothers come in, Andrew and Tristan Tate, who allegedly convert to Islam, although they're not particularly persuasive converts based on the way that they act there. But I mean, the way that they talk, for instance, this notion of kind of spreading your seed, that's a manly thing to do. That is a directly anti-biblical claim there, wherever you want to source it, whether it's Islam, paganism, or somewhere else there. Yeah. And then, Larry, you do have the rise here, and this is potentially most pernicious. It's mostly an online phenomenon for now, but God willing, it'll stay that way. Of some people who say very, not just anti-Israel, but in many ways anti-Semitic things, and they do so through the through the ostensible prism of speaking in the name of Christ. And that to me is most troubling, because American Christianity, going back to our founding, has been profoundly philo-Semitic. I talk at great length about the philo-Semitism of the founders in this book. There, everyone from John Adams and Lincoln and Washington to Abraham Lincoln himself, who was a tremendous friend of the Jews there. So this to me is profoundly concerning there. But I mean, look, we don't have to overthink this. There's no reason to overthink this. You mentioned the New Testament, the Old Testament there. Based on the number of pages, if you look at the Christian Bible, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's literally like 75 to 80% of the Christian Bible is the Old Testament, which for us is just our whole Bible, the Hebrew Bible there. We obviously have so much more in common than we have opposed. And there are some people out there that are saying, oh, the Christians' true allies are the Muslims, not the Jews there. I mean, where is this coming from? Like, literally, yeah. I mean, have y'all heard about this thing called the Crusades? I mean, like, where is this coming from out there? So, I mean, I mean, sometimes I just want to pinch myself. I mean, like, is this really happening there? But, hopefully, Larry, the book will hopefully bring some of these people back to the point of sanity, I hope.
Yeah, I do too. And maybe you and I will just fix it all. We'll take care of it. You handle the old, all right. Real fast, Josh, I do want to circle back quickly though. But I'm excited to get the book. I have not gotten it yet, but I plan on reading it on my next vacation. It's Israel and Civilization, the Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. Back to that syndicated column real fast that you wrote about the Harvard lawsuit and everything. I don't know if you saw this. I hate to be the one to bring it to your attention, but got some criticism from one of the writers at the LA Times. Here, take a look at this. It says, another Sunday, another screed of legalistic fantasy mumbo jumbo from Josh Hammer. None of it based on law or in reality. The LA Times would actually publish this stuff is insulting to all who can read above a third grade level. That's Christopher Knight. He's a Pulitzer Prize and Rabkin Lifetime Achievement winner and the LA Times art critic. Josh, do you care to respond to such a blistering attack on your column?
Not particularly, to be honest with you. I mean, look, I mean, tremendous kudos to the LA Times. The LA Times started running my syndicated column. So this is actually the same column that runs at Townhall and Newsweek.
But the fact that this guy, he doesn't want it published. He does not want this opinion published on their pages, and he's an art critic.
Yeah, God forbid, right? I mean, look, this guy is an art critic, right? So to kind of take our conversation, Larry, full circle, there's shut up and sing, there's shut up and dribble, there's shut up and judge. In this case, there's shut up and stare at Michelangelo or Da Vinci or whatever is occupying your time these days, I guess.
There it is. All right, Josh Hammer. Great stuff, as always. Love the podcast and very excited to read the book. And thank you. Thanks for doing a deep dive with us, making us smarter at the end of the conversation. And we'll continue to watch your columns, especially when we put it at Townhall. Thanks, Josh.
My pleasure, Larry. Thank you so much.
All right. That was good. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you can share plenty of this content with the crazy liberals on your Facebook page or in the cubicle next to you at work. Keep the faith. We've got the truth on our side and the Constitution on our side. We just got to go through a process, but we'll win. We'll continue to win. My name's Larry O'Connor. You can call me Larry.